Good afternoon. My name is Susan Doyle and I will be your facilitator today on behalf of Lean Construction Ireland. I would like to welcome you to Lean Construction Ireland's 30th webinar, the topic of which is Magic Mirror on the Wall, Who is the Fairest One of All? Putting the Spotlight on Quality by Professor Peter Love from Curtin University. If you have a question, please type it in the question box and we will consolidate and ask Peter in the second half of the webinar. If there are any questions that we don't get answered during the webinar, we will follow up by email afterwards. The speaker for today is Professor Peter Love from Curtin University. Peter is Professor of Infrastructure and Engineering Informatics at Curtin University and is a Fellow of the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors. He was also a member of the inaugural Australian Research Council's Engineering and Environmental Science Panel 2010-2011, Excellence in Australian Research Exercise, and reappointed for the 2018 evaluation process. Peter's leadership in research and active engagement with the construction and resources industry was acknowledged in 2010 when he was awarded the inaugural Scopus Young Australian Researcher of the Year Award, and later in 2012 was a nominee for Australian of the Year. In 2013, he was awarded a Higher Doctorate of Science by Curtin University in recognition of his substantial and sustained contribution to the field of civil and construction engineering. Peter's impact reaches beyond academia via media engagements, policy advice to governments and multilateral institutions, and consulting with Fortune 500 companies. The Australian newspaper identified Peter as one of Australia's top 40 research stars in 2019. I will now pass you over to Peter to start his presentation.
Oh, thank you very much, Susan, and I'd like to thank Lean Construction Ireland and the various sponsors for supporting this webinar and actually allowing me to present some of the work that my colleagues and I have undertaken the last 5 years. The work that I'm about to present to you is not solely my work, but also that of Professor Fran Ackerman, Pauline Teo, and John Morrison. So I think I've got about 45 minutes or so to present this talk to you. So if I seem to be glossing over issues, please feel free to follow up with some questions afterwards. So I want to start this presentation off with a preface. And this preface, it really is based on some work we initially did, which led to the work that I'm about to present. But prior to this work, that I'm just about to talk about, I've been looking at the concept of quality and rework, and for about 10 years, and as a result of doing this work I'm just about to present to you, I've actually started to reevaluate and rethink some of my initial work. So let me start with this particular preface. So I want to talk about a project which was the Barwing Water Alliance. This was a program alliance. It was 5 years, and it was worth approximately, at the contract value, of approximately $375 million. And part of that program alliance was to deliver 129 water infrastructure projects, such as water treatment plants, pipelines, and etc., and dams. And about halfway, about 2.5 years into the alliance leadership team and the alliance management team were concerned about the number of projects that were incurring cost and schedule delays due to rework. But this kind of coincided at this point in time where a batch of projects were actually coming to the end of their defects liability period, so there was a review in place. And what they realised was that during this 2.5 years, that none of the projects that had been delivered had actually issued any non-conformances for product quality. And at the same time, they realised that during this review that approximately projects were being delayed on average by about 3 weeks. Now, if they continued on this journey, they were facing a possible loss in the project of approximately $17 million, which equates to approximately 6% of the contract value. So if they carried on with the way they were doing their work, they would have ended up with a rework cost of approximately 6% of the actual contract value. Now, the Alliance leadership team and the Alliance management team were well aware of the quality issues, but felt at the time that the Alliance lacked the systems, the contractual power, relationships and culture to address the problem at hand. So a concerted effort, during the project, a concerted effort had been made within the Alliance to report safety and environmental issues, but still the processes for exposing quality incidents were inadequate. And in fact, what they found is that no mechanism was in place for them to actually report rework. And in fact, rework itself was considered to be part of poor work practices and demonstrated some sort of failure. So that issue was being overlooked. So, on the next slide. So, what they realised also is that safety incidents and near misses were increasing at the same time. So they decided to conduct a workshop, and during that workshop, one of the site supervisors had done some kind of homework and actually suggested during the workshop that a person being injured while attending to a rework was 4 times greater than when compared to doing regular work activities. Now that raised alarm bells, and so some analysis was undertaken, and they actually found the data revealed that 40% of safety incidents occurred during a rework event. So you can see on the slide here the distribution of incidents which occurred during a rework and non-rework event. So midway through this process, the Alliance decided to embark on a change management initiative that aimed to shift their prevailing mindset from a position where they were reactive to risk and focused on what went wrong to actually focusing on being proactive to risk and concentrating on what went right. So essentially what they were doing was they were shifting from what we call a fixed mindset, where it was performance and goal orientated, to a different form of mindset. So the intention was to learn not from success, but from the experience of individuals and teams involved in the delivery of the projects that were being constructed within the Alliance framework. So this was actually based in this change management process, however, was championed by kind of authentic leadership, engaging in a process of coaching and coaching individuals and teams where they were encouraged to continually ask questions and learn about how to reduce and contain rework. So in sum, the Alliance was able to recalibrate its mindset from a kind of a fixed mindset to a growth mindset. But it was only able to do this as leadership and management team recognized that there was an actual problem, and that problem was rework. Now, in all my years prior to coming into contact with the Alliance, I actually never seen this before in practice, and I've never seen it afterwards. And we've written extensively about this particular Alliance project in the literature. So this Alliance itself formed the basis for the research that I'm actually going to talk to you about now. So let's just stop for a moment and think about the concept of rework. Now, there's various definitions of rework that exist in the literature. There's a definition which I proposed many years ago, which was the unnecessary effort of redoing a process or activity that was incorrectly implemented the first time. Now, that definition is a bit vague, really, I think, in retrospect, and it kind of included lots of things, as in terms of change orders as well. So, in the work that we've been doing of late, and I need to put a caveat here, is that we're looking at quality on site and that quality is in the form of rework. Now, taking this into account, probably the CII and the Construction Industry Institute in the US, and the definition proposed by Professor Robinson Fyax, probably more pertinent here. And that one, and we can see this as what it is here, the total direct cost of redoing work in the field, regardless of the initiating cause, which excludes change orders, variations, and errors caused by off-site manufacture. So we're only concerned with actually the rework, or those errors which are actually caused on site. Now, I mentioned that I've been looking at this topic of rework for many years now, and I think what we need to acknowledge here that rework itself is what we call a wicked problem that may never be able to be solved due to the constant change and the challenges that confront construction, particularly in light with with the emergence of digital technologies such as building information modelling, using artificial intelligence, and technologies such as that. So, with these new technologies, we see a whole new range of problems start to materialize. It's okay for software vendors to actually say building information modelling will reduce rework on site by X percentage, but there's actually no scientific proof that that actually occurs. So, besides, so as a result of having the privilege to observe and interact with the Alliance, we were, Professor Ackerman, John Morrison and Pauline and I, we were provided the opportunity to further examine the issue of rework with several Tier 1 contractors in Australia. And so I'm going to focus this webinar on what we found and actually observed in practice. Now, some of the issues which I will talk about towards the end of this webinar will integrate and build upon the work that's been actually undertaken with the Barwon Water Alliance. So, a perennial question that we often come across in construction is how can construction organisations improve quality in their projects and mitigate the risk of defects, engineering failures and rework? Now, I want to point out there, I don't have all the answers, and I suggest it's simply based, the answers which I purport are based on my observations of kind of practice, and that's what's been going on in several of the Tier 1 contractors that we've examined. And so the way that I've structured this particular presentation is first that we're going to examine the problem that construction faces. That's the context. So I will draw on examples and just to highlight some issues which have occurred in the UK, which those who've tuned in this webinar in the UK will be familiar with. And if there are those in Australia or elsewhere, will be familiar with too. Then drawing on aspects of the data we've collected, we will try to understand why adverse quality outcomes materialise. And then finally, I'll put forward how we can reflect and learn to improve quality. So I want to throw it out there on a different way of actually looking at how we actually address this problem. Now, I do recognise that there are policy-related issues that we need to take into account, and there are issues related on that we take from a more operational perspective. But what I want to try to highlight here is some of the organisational issues from a contracting point of view, from the construction organisations, some of the mindset or the change in mindset that we need to embrace. So let's look at the context. Right, so poor quality is not a new phenomenon in the construction industry. It's something we've been trying to tackle with for a long time. In fact, I was actually reading a book today by James Rayner. It's called Hard Hats, and it was published in 1979. And there's a chapter in there on, it's called Worker Mistakes. And if you, when I was reading this chapter, there was actually references to studies which had been undertaken by sociologists in the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s about the issues of poor quality in construction. So this is not a new phenomenon by any means. But recent events in the UK, in Australia, for example, have brought this to the fore. And one particular event, which I'm sure you're familiar with, was the independent inquiry into the construction of the Edinburgh schools, led by Professor Cole, provides a really pertinent example here. And the quote by the chair of the CIOB Commission at the time, Paul Nash, referring to the Edinburgh School, is really pertinent here when he refers to actually urgent changes are required to the way that quality is managed. Now, I'll actually pick up on this a little bit later in the presentation, but here's just one example from the UK, which many of you will be familiar with. Now, let's just turn to Australia. Now, on Christmas Eve in 2018, approximately 3,000 residents had to be evacuated from this 38-storey building referred to as the Opal Tower at Sydney Olympic Park, as the structure began to crack. An independent inquiry was undertaken at the request of the Minister for Planning and Housing for New South Wales. And the inquiry revealed that a litany of design and construction errors led to a failure of a hob beam on the building's 10th level, which resulted in structural damage. Now, the inquiry revealed quite a few interesting findings: that grouting had not been installed as specified in the design drawings, a dowel bar was incomplete. You can actually see on the right-hand side here that it illustrates some of the issues which had occurred. Precast concrete panels were not the same width as the hob beam that they were resting on, and actually wrong size reinforcement had been installed into the concrete panels. Now, while the building was deemed to be structurally safe, a considerable amount of rectification works, as in rework, due to errors and failures, was required to ensure that the building conformed to, and this work's still ongoing, to the National Construction Code and the Australian Standard for Concrete Structures. Now let's go to the next example. This is this is part of the North West Rail Link in Sydney. And this was an incident that happened in October 2016, where a failure occurred during the construction of a viaduct for the SkyTrain. So an independent inquiry here found that several quality control issues had occurred, and it was revealed that grout had not been cured and installed as required with the work method statement, and that the push-pull ties had been installed before with the casting of the stitch port. So again, we can see actually, some of these issues are bringing to the fore in the media. But if you look at the kind of everyday sort of projects, we can see examples of this occurring almost being very, very, very common. This particular project, the Perth Children's Hospital, where a significant number of non-compliance issues surfaced during the construction. Here, building materials were found to have been sourced through multiple layers of subcontracting with complex supply chains. This, coupled with an over-reliance on third-party certification, contributed to non-conforming products being installed. Now, here we have the case of non-compliant fire doors being installed into the hospital. We saw stainless steel pipes being installed and corroding and leaking, having to be replaced. And when they were replaced, after 14 days, they started corroding again, so they had to be replaced again. There was asbestos and contaminated materials found in the roof panels. And if you look on the side, down the side here, you'll see a whole series of the external facade here. There was over 1,600 panels had to be replaced because they were damaged while they were being stored on site and while they were being installed, so they had to be replaced as well. Another contemporary project in Perth is the Forestfield Airport Link, which is a $1.8 billion rail project which links the city to the new airport and out to the stations past the hills. It's approximately about 8.5 kilometres in length, with about 8 kilometres being underground. Construction commenced in early November 2016, but due to numerous quality problems and a series of workplace safety incidents, the projects had to be delayed from its original completion date from 2020 to 2021. Now, during the project's construction, the lives of workers have been repeatedly placed in danger due to safety breaches. Now, if you look at the picture here on the left, you'll see that actually the person is actually doing some rework, and there's actually no scaffolding or anything around while he's actually doing it. So that was somebody who'd actually taken a photograph and reported it to the press. So, what's the financial impact of having to do rework? Now, this is a really contentious issue. Now, the CII in the US has come out and said that it's 5% of value of contract value, or of project value. Now, many studies have attempted to determine the cost of rework, but frankly, the figures presented are unreliable as they've been tended to be based upon questionnaire surveys or self-surveys. The other issue is that there's a difference between project-based rework and actually construction-based rework. Because in the case of project-based rework, we're taking into account change orders. Now, for a contractor, if there's a change order or a scope change, admittedly, it might require rework, but you know that actually work's going to take place. And generally speaking, under the contract, you'll be paid for any additional changes. So there's not a direct cost to the contractor per se. However, in the case of construction-based rework, if it was 5%, most contractors would be going out of business because margins tend to be, well, in Australia, tend to be fairly low. So a lot of the issues of what you see on in studies about what the actual costs of rework are actually unreliable. And the reason being for it is because many contractors actually don't measure the costs of rework. It's an issue it's been given is not considered unless they take it part of their non-conformances. Now, the companies that we've been dealing with have suggested there's no standard definition of rework, like I mentioned to you before, and there's no standard way of classifying what rework costs are. I've had this conversation several times with them, and but those who are quality managers will be very familiar with the cost of quality. So if you followed the principles of the cost of quality, looking at prevention, appraisal, and failure costs, we would be able to actually determine what these particular costs are. So in the context of rework, we've observed in our research that it really provides contractors with what we call uncomfortable knowledge. It's denied, it's dismissed, it's diverted, it's displaced. And in fact, what's more, when it does occur sometimes in projects, it's often explained away as a one-off occurrence. But the reality in construction is we do have rework, and it's being generally ignored by contractors, generally speaking. I know there might be some firms that are actually measuring it, but in the studies that we've done, no firm really is actually measuring the costs of it and actually identifying its particular causes. So for us, in our studies, we refer to rework has been the inevitable discovery, what we would rather not know. And in fact, we can call this an unpleasant unsurprise, and that's a sublimity, which is the opposite of serendipity. You know, nobody really wants to talk about this particular issue. So, regarding causation, if you actually look at the literature, you'll see predominantly these prefixes of poor, lack of, inappropriate. But as I'll go on to say, these lack context, because the identification of single factors, it only describes a proximal cause, those clearest the event. And I'll give you an example now here of the issues which typically are identified with rework. So if we look at this particular diagram, we'll say, if we look at program, unrealistic schedule, insufficient resources, poor constructability, and probably one which often comes up, even when we're talking about disputes, is this notion of poor communication. But what does this really mean? And I'll give you an example here. You see, when we talk about poor communication, you see problems do not arise because X does not communicate Z to Y, but the way that Y interprets Z in light of some prior experience, which X does not know about. So as a result, X fails to make allowances for Z, and Y does not realize X, because Y thinks both their experience are representative. So there's this lack of understanding and interpretation of what actually is being communicated. And so there's a lack of context when we say poor communication, and it's based on our experiences and what we've observed. So let's have a look at the nature of rework itself and the issues that contribute to it. So on the left-hand side here, you'll see before. And if you're familiar with the safety literature, you'll see snippets here of the work of Professor James Reason. So on the left-hand side here, we'll see we've got organisational and managerial decisions. Well, these organisational managerial decisions influence the way that people work, and therefore their propensity to either commit an error, which can be unintentional, or it could be what we call a violation, which is intentional. So it's a behavioural aspect that influences this. Now, we can look at two types here. We've got action errors, which are the non-attainment of a goal and non-conformity to some sort of form of plan. And these can be categorized as being slips, which are attention failures, lapses, memory failures, those related to rule-based and knowledge-based, which the literature categorizes as mistakes. Or we get what we call these violations, which are conscious efforts to break a rule. And normally, these conscious efforts to break a rule are normally undertaken to make work more efficient. So the essential differences between them is that one's intended and the other one's a deliberate action to deviate from goals, plans, and standards. And so they both interact to influence both quality and safety. And therefore, there's a delay. Sometimes, if they're not identified, there's a delay. We get rework. We can get a safety incident as we're undertaking rework, or vice versa. And then after the event, we get this loss of profit. We've got the loss of productivity, accidents, deaths, etc. So let's just look at the traditional focus of what we've seen on how error is viewed in construction. So when errors occur, there's a natural reaction to apportion blame and engage in hindsight bias. There also resides a fear of being caught for making errors, which can result in people hiding them when they occur. This fear creates a negative mindset towards error making. So there's a belief, that general belief, that errors are a negative. And we often see companies espousing this concept of a zero vision or zero defects. Well, I think Decker, Professor Sidney Decker, really sums it up here, where he says, zero commitment is worth striving for, a zero target isn't. Or put differently, have zero commitment to a zero target. And what Decker's trying to say here is that we'll never, ever get to a point where we will have a zero defects. There has to be a point where we actually have to accept that they're actually going to exist. So what we tend to find in construction is that in making an effort to improve quality and also safety, organisations make sure that people don't contribute to the trouble again. And in doing so, they add more rules in, they automate more reprimands. And so this managerial response, or this reactive response, may not only frustrate the larger body of employees and those in projects, but also create inefficiencies and losses in productivity. Now, I'll allude to this a little bit later, and because this is akin to what the academics, Professor Alverson and Spicer, referring to as functional stupidity. So, against this backdrop, we try to acquire an understanding and make sense of rework. And we were provided the opportunity to examine quality safety data, as well as speak with employees of several tier 1 construction contractors here in Australia. So I will give you an example of what we unearthed and identified some kind of key organisational issues that really influenced their quality outcomes. So let me just draw on this one particular contractor to start off with. This was a tier 1 contractor. We were given access to documentation between 2007, 2015. And as a result of this documentation, we were able to look at 569 projects. And we were given unlimited access to the quality reports for every single project, the safety reports, the cost reports, safety investigations that had been undertaken, project reviews, financial reviews, and then we undertook a whole series of interviews. So you can see that there is, just from this one organisation alone, that we were given access to an enormous amount of data. But one of the things I really want to point out here is that this organisation was very brave and courageous in its ways. It was able to open up its books and let a research team come in and have a look at what they were doing. I mean, this company had a genuine interest in actually looking at ways of actually improving and addressing the issue of rework, which was happening in their projects. So out of these 210 projects, 210 of them reported that they experienced non-conformances. Now, I like to point out here is that when we're looking at rework in the context of this particular example, it's based on actual non-conformances. I do acknowledge that this is only actually briefly touching the problem, because rework can manifest in other ways. But we weren't actually had access to that data, and a lot of that data actually isn't recorded. So this is based on actual non-conformances. So we looked at a total of 19,000 plus non-conformances, and out of those 19,000, we found that 9,000 were classified as rework, and the remainder were scrap, as use, and you know, a small proportion were actually unclassified. We were able to examine a range of projects, you know, building projects, infrastructure, and rail. So what did we find? So let me just highlight some of the overall issues that we found with this particular piece of analysis that we undertaken. I won't go into detail because the information you can have a look on the right here. But in this tier 1 contractor, we found 48% of non-conformances that were reported occurred in only 42 of the 210 projects. So that's 48% of the costs. I mean, we found that 84% of the total costs of non-conformances were due to rework. And this, over this 8-year period, this 84% in costs translated to a 15% loss in annual profit to the organisation itself in actually performing rework. Now, in another study in another contractor, which we replicated exactly the same method and what we actually did, we found the actual loss in profit for this tier 1 was a staggering 28% over a similar sort of time period. It's actually a phenomenal amount of money when you actually think about it. So let's drill down a little bit deeper now. So I took a sample of randomly of 10 projects for you to have a look at. So the mean from these 210 projects that we looked at, and in terms of the non-conformance rework costs, the mean cost as a percentage of the contract value was 0.18%. If you look on this sample of 10, it's approximately 0.79%. But this value of 0.18% of contract value equates to a very similar study that we did with a contractor in 2000, where their mean cost was at 0.15%. So you know, the figures are very, very, very compatible when we look at across it, a couple of different companies. So let's just drill down a little bit deeper. So what were the sources of these non-conformances, this rework? Well, probably no surprise to the contracting firms which are maybe listening on this webinar. Structural steel work, formwork, and concrete were the primary area where rework costs were occurring. And if you look on the right-hand side here, this was a categorization by this particular contractor. We see ITPs and process control and procedural compliance, and that procedural compliance is primarily due to what we call, you know, lack of supervision, so to speak. So let's go to give you some examples of where rework occurred. We can see on the left-hand here columns of alignment on a multi-story building. I don't know how you address that one. There's the firewall starter here, which is in the incorrect position. There's the changes, differences in levels here with the paving, which is 20 mils higher than the other side. So these are just examples of which from projects that we've actually pulled out. So let's go into here looking at some of the reasons from the interviews that we've undertaken and what they recall that we interviewed with several of the organisations. Well, the first one is competing demands. What we realised is that on many projects that non-conformances weren't being measured. And when we found out why, it was senior management within the company didn't want to hear about non-conformances. And what had happened is that on projects, emphasis was being placed more on safety, the management of safety, rather than quality. So we saw that quality was becoming almost a second cousin to safety. And here we saw tensions and trade-offs between the amount of time and resources being given to safety versus quality in particular projects. The other issue is that many of the projects, now this wasn't consistent throughout all projects within organisations. Some projects, actually project managers insisted that non-conformances were being measured. Whereas in other projects, the project managers were discouraging non-conformances to be issued and to be identified. And we saw this being on some projects where non-conformance exceeded a certain value, for example, 100,000, they needed to be reported to senior management. Now, what happened then was that the project managers on the job actually made sure that the non-conformance was split into a series of smaller non-conformances, so it didn't have to be identified up to senior management. And so, you know, lots of issues weren't being reported to senior management, but on the same hand, senior management didn't want to know about non-conformances because it was seen to be a poor reflection of practice. The next issue we identified was leadership and managerial actions. And here we saw an incapacity and a disinclination to exercise reflection. So here, employees accept and adhere to established rules, routines and norms, which are given to them by their project manager on their particular job. So managers perform work in accordance with what they want. Here what we saw was managers performed work in accordance with what the organisation wants. So if non-conformances were seen to be considered to be a reflection of poor practice, then they wouldn't report them, even though they were occurring in their particular projects. I think probably the most telling thing that we noticed in our interviews with many tier ones was the absence of psychological safety. And here, what I mean by this is being able to speak up and have a voice when an error or a non-conformance arises in a project and feel comfortable to identify that there's actually a problem. And what we found, this isn't the case in all projects, but we found that this varies in the organisation itself. So what we see sometimes is these subcultures happening out on projects in different types of projects. And these subcultures, many managers lose touch with their employees that operate at the actual cold face of what's actually going on within the projects that they're actually working with. And finally, this myopic application of instrumentation rationality. And what we mean by here is that project managers on sites are too keen on reporting and recording safety statistics and at the same time overlooking the real context and their moral obligations and ignoring quality. And what we found here is that many of these issues which are arising because of safety are actually occurring during quality events, actually during actually performing rework itself. So what can we learn from this? Now, traditionally in construction, we've taken this, and I mentioned about the Barwon Water Alliance at the very beginning, that they had this focus, this goal orientation approach, this fixed mindset on reporting their statistics and ignoring the context. and that when in this kind of error prevention environment, that the natural reaction for management is to restrict, put in place tighter procedures, put in prescriptive tools in place, and we can see that this really hasn't been working. So I'm suggesting we take this alternative view and we go back to looking at the this kind of the organisational decision making and what Paul Nash referred to, is that things have to change, and this change really needs to start from a strategic level within the organisation if we're to commit to getting it right, to create an environment where people get it right first time in projects. So I'm advocating we take this strategic view and turning things upon their head, and by doing that, I'm suggesting that we think about the context within which poor quality outcomes occur. And in the context of rework is a function of human inactions and a byproduct of the project environment which you're working in. So understanding the context of its occurrence or reoccurrence provides the basis for being able to anticipate, adapt and respond to mitigate its negative consequences. Now, in an environment that where construction is in this era of big data and artificial intelligence, for many contractors, information now should be used as the basis for your competitive advantage. You've got this data, you're better able to assess risks. So being able to respond and adapt to risk. Yet again, if you actually look at how data is being collected, it's being very, in many contractors, being very collected in a very unstructured format. So there is a need now to start collecting data from site to be able to improve our risk management and adapt to uncertainty environment, and actually think about how we can actually forecast and adapt to possible rework. So in order to do this, I've advocated we kind of move from this error prevention environment that you can see on the left-hand side, which I mentioned at the beginning, where we worry about making an error before its occurrence. We get blamed for it. We move from this environment where errors can and need to be prevented to an environment where errors are inevitable and potentially can be turned into something positive, and where errors can happen, because errors themselves, it's only through committing a mistake or an error that we're able to learn and become innovative. So I've been advocating the concept of engaging and adapting error management in construction. Now, the Barwon Water Alliance, when I started off with a preface for this webinar, it was in the realm of this error prevention environment, and it was able to recalibrate its mindset to adapt to an error management environment. And so from that point of view, I can give numerous examples where as soon as an error or a piece of rework occurred, they had workshops, they informed all their subcontractors about a particular event and how and why it occurred, and asked their input on actually how it could be mitigated. So it was a very open environment, and the subcontractors or their contractors actually learned with the alliance as it moved forward. So now I mentioned about the three areas that we've looked at in this particular talk. From my experience and observation of practice, there are three particular things which are mitigating or acting as barriers to addressing positive, safe quality outcomes, particularly rework within construction. And Alderson and Spicer, in their book on stupidity management, refer to 3 particular aspects which contribute to what we call functional stupidity. The first one is the inability to critically reflect about what we are doing. So why are we actually doing this? The second is the inability to understand why we do it, and that's the particular processes why we're doing. So, for example, you know, if somebody does something wrong on a project, rather than implementing a whole series of new policies and procedures, address the problem at hand. The third one is the inability to determine the consequences of their activities beyond the immediate task at hand. So these 3 barriers here are what I think are inhibiting our ability to move forward to address errors within construction. But if we're able to overcome these and adapt a error management culture, we can reduce rework and simultaneously improve safety. Now, the tier 1 contractors that we've looked at, their safety statistics are pretty average. They're actually, when you compare them to the national average in terms of lost time, lost frequencies and other statistics, they're very average. Now, an underlying factor here is that we found, and some of them, is that there's a 70%, a 0.7 or a 70% association between rework and safety. So it logically holds that if we can reduce rework, we can actually improve safety. And that would mean that many of the contractors whose safety statistics have stagnated over the last few years, if they actually started to focus on quality and start reducing the amount of rework and put resources, equal amounts of resources into quality of the organisation, they'll not only reduce the safety, but they'll actually improve the profitability. Now, on the Barwon Water Alliance, we observed that error management was in practice. And I don't think that Barwon Water did this on purposely. It just actually naturally occurred. So they had in place, after this 2.5-year period, they put in place 3 particular areas. One, knowing an error has occurred, so they inform people within the alliance, that's the detection. Knowing what was done wrong and what should have been done, the explanation, which people need to know, and handling and recovering, knowing how to undo the effects of an error and achieve the desired state. Now, there are 5 principles here that underpins this. It's one, obviously, is communicating the error. Actually, so once an error has been identified, the idea of error management is to mitigate its negative consequences as soon as possible and actually communicate the error, share knowledge, analyse. So collect data and analyse where these error occurrences are occurring. Provide assistance, put resources into actually identifying and educating possibly people about these errors, and actually coordinate and handle them within the organisation. But one thing I would have to say, but this does, like I said at the beginning, is it has to be underpinned by leadership, and that leadership, I believe, needs to be authentic in nature. So one of the things that we have done is we've tried to conceptualize this into a framework. Now, this is something that my colleague and I have only just recently developed. You may well be critical of it, but so I'm just sharing this with you now. So there are 4 components to this that I believe that we need to look at if we want to manage the risk and uncertainty of rework. Now, the thing with rework is that we can make it a known unknown. Now, it used to be in the realm of an unknown because we never knew about it. But now if we start measuring it and managing it, we can actually make it a known unknown. So first of all, we need to, what I believe, is empower people to have a voice and openly report and share errors and violations. And that means, in the context of non-conformances, is actually openly report and actually identify them in the organisation. Then we need to define and tolerate acceptable levels of error. Now, what's acceptable? We need to know, we need to acknowledge that error is acceptable, but what level is acceptable? But we also need to plan and prepare for the risks of rework and any unexpected events. So a lot of these unexpected events we can have by putting in place, by being able to adopt an approach to resilience, by being able to anticipate what could go wrong before the beginning of a project. Now, I wonder how many organisations are actually putting in place mechanisms to actually anticipate what might go wrong. And so that might be having in place what we refer to as a maestro, a project maestro who questions everything and puts what-if scenarios in place and looks for the total and unexpected that may occur. Now, I'm very well aware that we can learn from previous projects and we have contingency in place, but something always can go wrong. So we need to be planning for and preparing ourselves for that unexpected event. The next stage is to actively promote learning through and encourage people to question. So constantly question decisions that are being made on site, but giving people the confidence to be able to say, sorry, or look, you shouldn't be doing that. We need to stop work until we get this resolved, rather than being subject to production pressure. And finally, we need to establish measures for non-conformances and identify opportunities to avoid rework and ensure resources are available for continuous improvement in quality and safety. And one of the things there is possibly looking at, and I'm sure many organisations may well have some forms, maybe benchmarking, but benchmarking yourself against other organisations again, and developing leading and lag indicators for both quality and safety simultaneously. So this is just a conceptual framework that we've produced at the moment, and we're trying to work through to actually operationalise this at the moment. But what underpins this framework for the organisation is the ability to become mindful. And this is what Beck and Sutcliffe called it, that mindful organisation, looking at being able to deal with the risks and investing in substantial resources, those which are financial and attentional, the ability to detect issues early. Again, this means possessing a preoccupation with failure and anticipating what might go wrong. Another issue is to have this reluctance to simplify, but also be sensitive to the nuances that result in failure, and then commit to have the capacity to deal with unanticipated changes. But I think also is that be ready and be willing to listen to experts within your organisation about, particularly your quality experts, about what needs to be undertaken. So I'm sure I've glossed over a few issues, and I know I've nearly taken up an hour now talking about these concepts. But if there are any questions, I'm more than willing to take them. And lots of the issues that I've brought up in this webinar are available in many of the actual papers that we've actually written.
Thank you, Peter, for that very insightful presentation. We are just out of time, but if any questions do come in, what I'll do is I can send them on to Peter and he can engage with you directly. A copy of this webinar will be sent out to everyone who has attended the webinar. We will send out the information for February's webinar shortly, via LinkedIn, Twitter and newsletter. Once again, thank you from Peter and myself on behalf of Lean Construction Ireland. You can follow Lean Construction Ireland on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook and through the website leanconstructionireland.ie. Enjoy the rest of your day and be lean. Thank you, Peter.
Bye.